even starting a new job, only to find out that your boss is less than ideal. And to help us navigate and deal with a difficult boss is executive coach Teresa Vozza. Good morning, Teresa.
Good morning.
Nice to have you in studio in person.
I know,
so
I
everything
love
you've
it.
done with us is virtual. It's been.
It has been.
Here we are. Okay,
Yep.
now we need to virtually get right into this right now because we're seeing a lot of people talk about this. We heard quiet quitting is a thing because people aren't happy with where they work. What are some of the trends that you're seeing in the workplace that we should even be concerned about?
Yeah, there are many trends, to be honest. I would say the most alarming right now is that if you look at two of the bigger outfits that have done most of the research, Gallup, McKinsey, what we're seeing is that we know that bosses have a large role to play in workers' not only their career satisfaction, their life satisfaction. So that's an onerous responsibility. Second to that is also we're seeing that of that, over 75% of employees cite their boss as being one of the biggest stressors in their roles. That's a lot of people. And it's concerning because what happens is then you get employees coming into work that have no emotional attachment to their boss or to their teams and only doing the bare minimum, and you're seeing the quiet quitting, and you're seeing people start to tune out. Not good for performance and not good for mental health, which we also know is at an all-time high.
So I'm thinking, there is an element of sometimes some people don't like to deal with authority and they just don't like being told what to do. And I don't think that's the same as having a difficult boss.
Yeah.
So twofold, how do we know we've got a difficult boss and how can we handle that situation?
Yeah, great question. I think, and what you raised too is a really important point, is that just because a boss can be demanding doesn't necessarily mean that they are difficult, right? So understanding what is truly toxic versus what is truly tough. So for example, when we're thinking about a toxic boss, these are usually people who are belittling, who are condescending. They could be misogynistic, they could be racist, they could be devaluing people in front of others. Those are very obvious outward signs. Whereas a tough boss or a more demanding boss, I used to work for many of those, are individuals you generally still respect. They may ask you a lot of questions, they might still demand more of you, they may ask you to go back and do more research. That would be what I would call maybe demanding or intense, but not necessarily toxic.
So then if they are toxic, how do we deal with that? How do we deal with a difficult boss?
Yeah, well, first I think you have to understand their why. Right? So I think this is where we go back to understand what are the stresses and pressures that they may be under, not to absolve, but to understand. We often hear a lot about how we bring our whole selves to work, right? And so do bosses. So we don't know what's going on in their lives either. And so ask questions is like one of the first things. Practice self-leadership. Am I getting in the way? Am I jumping to conclusions? Am I giving in to the water cooler talk? Like, really understand what your part is to play. The third thing I would say is, go to HR only when absolutely necessary. And the reason I say that is because we want to make sure that we are building trust in the relationship. And when you go to HR right away, it doesn't give the benefit of the doubt of having initiated a conversation yourself. And when you initiate that conversation, you practice asking for what you need.
We know that a lot of people that are employees are going to watch this segment and kind of compare what their bosses. Bosses that are watching this.
Yeah.
What would you say to them in order to be a great leader? Because to me, a great leader elevates people around them instead of belittling them, right?
Yep.
What would you say to bosses that are watching right now to help them if they're thinking, oh man, I do some of these things, how can I change and adjust?
Yeah, well, I think first is take stock. Are you yourself under a lot of stress? Are you yourself under a lot of pressure? And ask your employees, you'd be surprised at the candor that employees have if you were just to simply ask them, hey, how am I doing? Are there times in which maybe I am devaluing your work or not paying enough attention? So have that conversation would be the first step. I think the second is you don't know what you don't know, right? So this is where feedback from trusted mentors and coaches and other people come in who can help you see those blind spots, because we all have them, right? It's not just the employees, it's the bosses as well. So I think those are two really good right out of the gate strategies.
And so just before we wrap up, how do we know when it's time to quit? And when we quit, do we go scorched earth, or do we tell them what we really think? How do we not burn the bridges for the future, or do we care? If this person is that toxic, do we want them to really really know?
Yeah. Well, I think if it's truly toxic, and there's a resource on my website for anyone that really wants to know what is toxic, then I absolutely believe you need to make an exit strategy. There's no room for that. And I think that if you are ready to go, and even if you can't go, because people have bills to pay, right? And so then I think we need to ensure that we give them the tools and the coping mechanisms necessary.
Thank
Here we
you
go.
so much.
TeresaVozza.ca. Great advice, great tips this morning. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank